What if everything you think you know about Jesus is only half the story? Not wrong necessarily, just incomplete. And what if the version of Jesus you grew up with, the one passed down through your culture, your family, your religious tradition, or even your rejection of religion, was shaped less by the actual man and more by the people who needed him to be something specific? Stay with me, because this is not an attack on anyone's faith. This is an invitation to think differently about one of the most extraordinary human beings who ever walked this earth. Here is the uncomfortable truth that almost nobody wants to sit with. Jesus of Nazareth was a real historical person. The vast majority of serious scholars across all backgrounds and disciplines accept this. That part is not actually the debate. The debate, the one that has been raging for 2,000 years and shows absolutely zero sign of stopping, is about what kind of man he was, what he actually meant, and who he was actually speaking to. And that debate reveals something fascinating not just about Jesus, but about us, about what we need him to be. Let's start by zooming out. Right now on planet Earth, roughly a third of all people identify as Christian. They believe Jesus was the literal Son of God, that he performed genuine miracles, died for human sin, and physically rose from the dead. Another quarter of humanity, the Muslims, believe he was one of the greatest prophets who ever lived, born of a virgin, capable of miracles by God's permission, but not divine himself, and importantly, not crucified. Jewish people, who represent a much smaller portion of the global population but carry enormous historical weight in this story, largely view him as a false messiah whose followers misunderstood or distorted his message. And then, there are the secular thinkers, the atheists and agnostics, who see him as a remarkable social reformer and moral philosopher whose story got mythologized over time. 4 major positions. 4 completely different Jesuses, all of them drawing from overlapping but distinct source material, all of them convinced they have the right picture. And here is what strikes me as the most interesting thing about this situation. Every single one of these groups is actually responding to something real about the man. They are all touching different parts of the same elephant and describing an entirely different animal. So, what does the alternative narrative actually look like? What happens when you try to step outside all 4 of those camps and look at Jesus not through the lens of doctrine, not through the lens of scientific skepticism, and not through the lens of political or cultural convenience, but through the lens of the actual world he was born into? First-century Judea was not a peaceful, spiritually serene place. It was occupied territory. The Romans were in charge, and they were efficient, ruthless, and completely indifferent to local religious sensitivities unless those sensitivities threatened order. The Jewish population was divided. You had the Pharisees, deeply committed to legal and ritual observance, convinced that faithfulness to Torah was the path to national restoration. You had the Sadducees, the priestly class, more accommodating to Roman power, more skeptical of concepts like resurrection. You had the Zealots, who believed armed resistance was the only answer. And you had the Essenes, a kind of separatist monastic movement who had essentially given up on mainstream society altogether. Into this fractured, occupied, anxious world, Jesus appears. And here is what the alternative narrative reveals that the standard religious packaging often obscures. Jesus was politically dangerous. Not dangerous in the way a general is dangerous. Dangerous in the way a poet with a megaphone is dangerous in a surveillance state. He was saying things that directly undermined the authority structures that kept Roman occupation and religious hierarchy functioning together. When he said the kingdom of God belongs to the poor, that was not a feel-good platitude for a Sunday morning service. In a world where wealth was understood as a sign of divine favor and poverty was understood as divine punishment, that statement was socially explosive. When he touched lepers, when he spoke publicly with women, when he sat and ate with tax collectors who were essentially collaborators with the Roman economic machine, he was performing deliberate acts of social boundary demolition. He was not simply being kind. He was making a statement about who belongs inside the circle of human dignity. The Pharisees did not hate Jesus because they were villains. That framing has caused enormous damage historically. The Pharisees were actually the most popular religious leaders among ordinary Jewish people at the time. They were deeply pious, deeply committed, and deeply threatened. Not because Jesus was disproving their theology in some abstract sense, but because he was drawing massive crowds with a message that bypassed the entire system of religious authority through which they operated. He was essentially saying that access to God did not require their gatekeeping. You can imagine why that created friction. Now, here is where the alternative narrative gets philosophically interesting. Most of the world debates whether Jesus performed miracles. That is the flashpoint, the thing people argue about endlessly online and in theology classes and across dinner tables. But what if that debate, as important as it might be, has actually caused us to miss something equally stunning about the man? Jesus was a teacher who used story as his primary weapon. Not doctrine, not systematic theology, not rules, stories. The parables he told were not simple moral fables for children. They were sophisticated, sometimes deliberately confusing, often deeply uncomfortable challenges to the way his audience organized their social and spiritual world. The story of the Good Samaritan was not primarily about being nice to strangers. In its original context, where Jews and Samaritans had deep historical hostility toward one another, making the Samaritan the moral hero of the story was a provocation. It was Jesus saying that righteousness has no ethnic address, no tribal membership card. The parable of the prodigal son is often read as a comforting story about forgiveness, and it is that. But notice who is uncomfortable at the end of that story. The older son, the faithful one, the one who followed all the rules and never left. He is the one standing outside the party, furious. Jesus is deliberately making the rule followers in his audience feel the sting. He is telling them that their resentment of grace extended to others reveals something about the condition of their own hearts. That is not gentle Sunday school material. That is a psychological scalpel. This is the Jesus that tends to get softened in both religious and secular retellings. The religious versions often domesticate him into a brand ambassador for whichever denomination is doing the telling. The secular versions often reduce him to a kind of ancient humanist, a social justice teacher who got turned into God by enthusiastic followers after his death. Both of these framings lose something essential, because the people who actually knew him, who walked with him, ate with him, watched him operate in real time, these were not people who experienced him as simply a very wise and compassionate rabbi. They experienced him as someone who generated a kind of cognitive and spiritual disruption that they struggled to fit into any existing category. The language they reached for when trying to describe the experience of being around him was consistently extraordinary. The words they chose suggested someone who carried an authority that felt different from anything they had encountered before. Not authoritarian, not demanding, but deeply, unavoidably, present, and real. Now let's talk about the crucifixion, because this is where the alternative narrative perhaps diverges most sharply from both the devotional and the dismissive accounts. The standard religious framing is that this was a planned cosmic transaction, the sacrifice required to deal with human sin. The standard secular framing is that this was a predictable outcome, a charismatic disruptor who pushed the wrong people too far and paid for it with his life. But consider a third possibility. What if the crucifixion was the moment where Jesus most completely embodied the message he had been teaching? He had spent years telling people that the path to genuine life ran through surrender rather than control, through giving rather than grasping, through absorbing rather than retaliating. He had told his followers that the grain of wheat has to fall into the ground and die before it produces anything. He had said that whoever tries to preserve their life will lose it, and whoever is willing to lose it will find something better. And then he walked into Jerusalem, knowing exactly what was waiting, and he did not run. He did not organize a resistance. He absorbed the full weight of the violence directed at him and responded from the cross with words of forgiveness toward the people doing it to him. Whatever you believe about the resurrection, whatever your framework for understanding the divine or the supernatural, that moment represents one of the most radical demonstrations of a philosophy being embodied rather than merely spoken that history has ever recorded. The man did not just teach a worldview. He walked it to its most extreme logical endpoint and refused to flinch. And the resurrection? Again, regardless of your theological position, consider what the story claims happened. Not simply that a man came back to life, which would be astonishing enough, but that death itself, the thing every human being is most fundamentally afraid of, did not have the final word. Whatever framework you use to interpret that, the psychological and cultural impact of that claim on the people who believed they had witnessed it was incandescent. It changed the direction of Western civilization. It changed the architecture of time itself. We literally count years from this person's birth. The alternative narrative I am offering here is not that Jesus was more or less than you currently believe. It is that he was more specific, more contextual, more challenging, and more genuinely strange than most of the packaging we have built around him allows. The comfortable Jesus who mostly agrees with your existing values and confirms your existing community's worldview is probably a reduced version of the historical figure. Because the actual Jesus, the one embedded in first-century Jewish-occupied Palestine, the one who disturbed literally everyone who encountered him for one reason or another, the one who was too radical for the religious establishment, too spiritual for the revolutionaries, too Jewish for the Romans, and too universalist for Jewish exclusivism, that Jesus is far more interesting and far more demanding than the versions we have inherited. And maybe that is precisely why, 2,000 years later, he still generates more argument, more art, more war, more charity, more conversion, more study, and more controversy than any other single human being who has ever lived. Not because the question of who he was has been settled, but because it stubbornly refuses to be. Every generation thinks it has finally figured him out. Every generation discovers it has not. And maybe that ongoing refusal to be fully contained or explained is itself a clue about the nature of what we are dealing with. Whatever Jesus was, he was not small. And the conversation about him is far from over.